back, everybody, to JL's Book Club, where we don't talk about Fight Club because I didn't read Fight Club. This month we've got 2 books to review, but first, as always, we've got our beverage of the month, and thank God there was a new one, because I think I've done a new beverage every month by coincidence, so thank God for this. Aperol Spritz. It's a product of Italy, and from what I can gather, it seems like the basic bitch spritzer of the year. So, move over, White Claw. Aperol Spritz is here, bitch. Anyway, 2 books this month. The first is 2054, okay? Not just my hourly wage as a low-level attorney, but a book about the future in AI. Now, it's the sequel to a book that I reviewed, I think, in the very first episode for all you long-time viewers of JL's Book Club. It was called 2034, and I loved that book. It was my number 3 book of 2022 or 2021, whatever. You don't care. I don't. But it was awesome. 2034 was awesome. It's by Eliot Ackerman and Admiral James Stavridis. And it was basically a military conflict between China and the U.S. I thought that book was awesome. So I said, of course I'll get the sequel. I was made aware of the sequel, and it's fine, if I'm being honest, because they have they have a trilogy planned. They have the military one, so I would say absolutely go read that. 2054, which is focused on AI. And then 84 is the third one they have planned, which is about the effects of climate change. So that will probably be the scariest. But 2034, I think, maybe leaned into their expertise as 2 military guys. Eliot Ackerman's a writer, but he is I think he's a Marine, a highly decorated Marine, and Admiral James Stavridis obviously is somebody very high-ranking in the Navy. So the first one, I think, leaned into their strengths, and it was really a compelling read. This one I was interested in because I'm like, AI is always in the news, all you hear about is AI. And I just, as a work of fiction, I just didn't enjoy it as much. I'm still going to get 2084 as kind of the tiebreaker, obviously, because the first one was so good. It's like, the second one, okay. It was solid, but it was, the first one was like, from start to finish, awesome. This one kind of had that good first half pacing and intrigue. And then when it gets resolved, I was just like, this kind of makes me feel better about AI, because if AI is as boring as like the second half of this, or as anticlimactic as the second half of this book, then we're all fine. Whereas the book about war involved like nuclear blasts in the US and China and India and Russia getting involved. So it was like, in a way, much scarier. So 2054, I would say go get 2034 for sure, and make up your own mind if you want to read 2054. And I think you'll like 2034 so much that you'll be like, well, let me try 2054. Maybe JL was wrong. So 2054, I'm sorry, you are you're the Hunter Biden to 2034's Beau Biden. Okay, to put it in presidential son terms. Now, the second book and the focus of this review is a book by Adam Higginbotham. You may recognize that name. I've reviewed a book of his before, and it also sounds like a rejected name for a Harry Potter Hogwarts school. You put the hat on, you got House Higginbotham. Anyway, he wrote Midnight in Chernobyl, which I reviewed in season 1 of JL's Book Club. And it's an excellent book. It had been New York Times top 10 book of the year. But I think I read it after seeing the HBO series Chernobyl, which is one of like the 10 most incredible things and harrowing things ever put on television, in my opinion. It's unbelievable. It's great. It's like, it stays with you. So I felt like, even though Midnight in Chernobyl kind of gives you a fuller, more detailed, and was a really great book, I couldn't help but like sort of say, yeah, but I'm still stuck kind of with the images of Chernobyl, the miniseries, in my mind. So great book, I recommend it. But his new book, Challenger, a true story of heroism and disaster on the edge of space. So funny note, this is his second book, and both involve disasters in 1986 that start with CH. So I don't know. I got lost on the subway when I was 7, on my 7th birthday in 1986. So if my name was Chauvin, like the guy who killed George Floyd, maybe he'd be covering me for his 3rd book, like 80 tragedies that happened in 86 that begin with CH, but fortunately my name doesn't have an H. So the legend of me getting lost in the New York City subway system, you know, you can only hear it here if you're a Patreon subscriber. But I was comforted by a young Latin woman. And I don't know if that's, you know, if that like imprinted on my mind or something, but it was like I was crying on the train and she was like, here, we'll get you to the police. And I was like, yes. And then anyway, guys, not part of the book club. Challenger is a fucking incredible book. I'm sorry I used the F word, but I can't impress upon you enough. This book is as emotional and like intense a reading experience as I've ever had. I would compare it to the most intense movies. Like now, Challenger, I remember seeing a Netflix documentary series on this. And for whatever reason, it did not have the same impact that Chernobyl did on me. It was interesting. It was, but I hate to say this. It was kind of like, I'll watch this. And it was like, you know, because we're just flooded with so much content that, you know, I watched it and it didn't, I wish I could say I was like, I remember tons about it, but I don't. And it was like a couple of years ago, I think I watched it. This book is, he obviously, I think Higginbotham must have a history in science or a background in science because his two books involve heavy discussions of like the science behind nuclear reactors and the science behind the space shuttles and Apollo, like the mission to the moon. So like he clearly is well versed with engineering and math and science. But this book is written so well and so intensely that you know what happens. I was in 1st grade when the Challenger blew up, but all I knew is, I just remember it happening. I don't remember if we were watching it in school like so many school children. I just remember my friend Joe, who had wanted to be an astronaut. And funny enough, I think he like, you know, he works in engineering and he's like a 5'10" athlete. So he's like, he actually would have been the perfect like sort of prototype, he's white, for an astronaut. But I remember in 1st grade, I still remember him being like, I don't want to be an astronaut anymore. And I wonder how many kids' dreams died that day with the explosion of the Challenger. But I just remember that, but I don't remember the buildup. I don't remember how big it was because I didn't watch Johnny Carson. I was in 1st grade. I don't remember the teacher, Krista McAuliffe, being on like all the late night shows and being like on the cover of all these magazines. I just remember the explosion. But and as many of you may know, ever since I turned like 37, and I think I'm just becoming whiter, I'm leaning, maybe with the death of my father, it was like the blackness started to leave me and I became a typical middle-aged white guy who's like, I'm really into astronauts now. I don't know, is that what happened? We'll never know. But, you know, if you look at pictures of me at sleepaway camp when I was 8, I looked like I was headed towards Obama looking. And then a right turn genetically happened in my teens and all of a sudden Adam Sandler became my future. But I became like obsessed with space and astronauts like 7 years ago. I read The Right Stuff by Tom Wolfe. First Man, Damien Chazelle's movie, incredible movie. The Right Stuff on Disney Plus, phenomenal miniseries that didn't, you know, it wasn't done by Marvel or Pixar, so they didn't really lean into it too heavy. But this is, and this is saying a lot, because there's been some great space content. This might be the best thing I've ever read or seen involving space. And my cinematographer right now is nodding her head like, wow, this is high praise. You are obsessed with space, you miserable fuck. And I just got a head tilt like, hey, if the shoe fits. But this book, you know what happens. But he takes you behind the science, and like whenever there's a chapter on these things, like these insulators called the O-rings, and you're just like, oh no, he's only telling me like 8 pages about this because this is going to be part of the catastrophe. But it's like, the way he pieces it together, you know what happens, but you see all the opportunities to change, all the near misses, all the near fatalities that happened before the Challenger that weren't corrected. And it's this, you don't, until I read this book, and this was all in hearings and stuff, but once again, I was 7. I wasn't watching congressional hearings, and now my tone is very Bill Maher. But I wasn't watching congressional hearings. I was, drinking juice boxes and bullying kids when I was a first grader. But what I learned so much about how these things were so preventable. And this passage I'm going to read for you. So obviously, highly recommend this book. It's to make a gripping thriller when you know what happens is an impressive literary feat. And it's sort of in a weird way a parallel to, and maybe I think I should reach out to this guy and see if he'll come on Rain on Your Parade and do like a Zoom conversation. But Chernobyl was like a failure of the state led to the heroism of people to fix it. Chernobyl, it took heroes and people risking and giving their own lives to stop the damage from Chernobyl. Whereas this is like, there were heroic efforts on the front end to stop this. And the higher ups, the bureaucrats, the CEOs didn't go with it, and it led to tragedy. So it's sort of this odd US and Soviet parallel in terms of, and I think somebody said about the Chernobyl miniseries, it might have been the creator of the Chernobyl miniseries who said this, and I can't remember, but it was basically Chernobyl could have only happened in a country like Russia, in Soviet Union, where the government was all powerful and couldn't be questioned. So you could have massive errors like that because they wouldn't hear. It was propaganda. They didn't want to hear about the failures and the damage and the problems with it because it would affect the image of Soviet Union as a superpower. But only in the Soviet Union, he said, in a country like the Soviet Union, could you then have people who were so, for a bad word, indoctrinated, but for a good sense, had national pride, that they would just go, I volunteer to go in and like shut off the nuclear water, and I'm going to turn into a radioactive death puddle in a week. But I'm going to do that for my country. Whereas like the US, it's almost it's like a flip side of the coin. Where it's like in this, you see, oh no, people were free to express their fears and to question authority and do this. And they presented information that if the higher ups had absorbed and accepted, could have prevented this. But instead, and that's the Spider-Man meme of the US and Soviet Union in the 80s, both had people on opposite ends willing to show courage and defiance. But the higher-ups in both cases made the bigger decisions that led to the tragedies. But it's almost like in reverse order. So look at that. Look at that, Higginbotham. I've almost created the Higginbotham cinematic universe where you see the parallels between the Soviet Union. I got to get him on the podcast, I think. He can't be doing too much. People don't read. So he's going to be thankful. He's like, oh, you read my stuff? I didn't think people did that anymore. But this book, let me read a passage and I'll let you get on with your day. But man, if... a lot of my people don't even buy my own special or watch my own special, and they certainly didn't get God and Country when I recommended it. But my God, can some of you get this book? It's a masterpiece. So, here's a passage from the night before the Challenger launch. There is an emergency meeting in the Utah headquarters of this company that was making the booster rockets for the Challenger. By this time, it was so late in the working day that the secretaries and other support staff were already heading home for the evening. With no one to type up the engineer's drafts into the formal charts required for the presentation, Bob Lund began to write them out himself, hand-lettering each view graph slide in careful block capitals. As Lund prepared the data, Wiggins and Mason, who were like the corporate folks, sat and talked quietly with Joe Kilminster, chief of the company's solid rocket programs, at the head of 3 large oak tables in the center of the MIC room, with NASA still threatening to open the lucrative shuttle booster contract to competition. They had a monopoly on these rockets for NASA. As you can imagine, that's worth billions of dollars. So the CEO, the heads up, the business folk are not too keen on losing that. And a crucial summit in Thiokol, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, it's Thiokol, so Thiokol, ongoing negotiations with the agency scheduled for the next day, the stakes for the teleconference were high. If the intent now isn't that bad timing? You're about to have a meeting the day of the launch to discuss your future contract with NASA. If their engineers intended to cancel the launch, Mason and Wiggins needed to understand the rationale for doing so as precisely as they could. By 6 p.m. in Utah, 8 p.m. Cape Canaveral time, the first of the 14 slides in the engineers' presentation were almost ready to send over to NASA, but there had been no time for them to rehearse or even review what they were going to say. As the handwritten pages began stuttering from the fax machines at Cape Canaveral and Marshall, many of the Thiokol team recognized that the data they had about the behavior of the joints in cold weather remained scant. Some seemed contradictory. As a result, the recommendations they would be making were subjective and qualitative. It was far from a perfect case based in hard engineering fact. Even so, it was one that they believed raised enough concerns about the flight safety of the Challenger mission to advocate a drastic course of action. The concluding chart Lund had drafted represented the unanimous recommendation of all 14 managers and engineers who would eventually gather in the MIC room, including even Jerry Mason and Cal Wiggins. Wiggins and Mason were not the higher-ups. They were like head engineers. They were not the CEO people. Let me repeat that sentence for effect because I just fucked up the dramatic effect of this last line. The unanimous recommendation of all 14 managers and engineers who would eventually gather in the MIC room, including even Jerry Mason and Cal Wiggins. Do not launch. And the next day they launched, and 7 people died. And I'm just going to say, I wanted to give you something tense, but not the end. It's worse. It's worse than just what we all saw on TV. Can't recommend a book highly enough as I recommend this one. And it was a gift from my nephew for my birthday. So does he know his ever increasingly white old man uncle? Or does he? So Challenger, Adam Higginbotham, phenomenal book. It's an incredible piece of writing and journalism and history. So highly recommend it. Next month, folks. Oh no, he's still going to be doing these next month? Yes, I am. I've got 3 books I'm going to read in the next month. Ambitious, I know, but I can do it. Now, the New York Times just released their 100 best books of the 21st century. By the way, Warmth of Other Suns, reviewed on this show last year, the number 2 book of the 21st century. It's that good. What was number 1? Some shit about white chicks. But number 2 book of the year. So I looked, and I've read several of the books on the list, but I have 7 books that I haven't yet read that I've acquired over the years that made the list. So I said, well, like a front-running bitch, why don't I pump those up to the front of the list so I can be all hip with the Times list? One book that I won't be reading this year is the 4th in the Lyndon Johnson series by Robert Caro, because I want to read those all together, but that's the one book that I didn't bump onto the list because I haven't read the first 3 in his mega series on Lyndon Johnson. But the first book that I own that made the top 20 is The Sellout by Paul Beatty. So I'll be reading that this month, and I'll let you know how that is. Not that you really need my opinion. I just told you it made the top 20 New York Times of the 21st century. So, but I've been meaning to read this, and that gives me an idea. Now, my father was born in August, so I figured what better way to honor him than to quit comedy and get a real job. Just kidding. I'm going to read a book about Haiti that I've heard great things on. It's called Haiti, The Aftershocks of History by Laurent Dubois. I hope it's pronounced Laurent Dubois and he's not like W.E.B. Du Bois. I hated that in school. When I learned it was W.E.B. Du Bois, I was like, that's like when I would meet Latin people who'd be like, it's Vasquez. And I'm like, actually, it's not. But it's Vasquez. Do you not even know how to say your own name? And no, I'm not Jean. I'm Jean. So, The Aftershocks of History by Laurent Dubois. Reading that. And then, speaking of creators, my dad was 50% in creating me. There's a new documentary nominated for an Emmy on Disney Plus about Jim Henson. But what's the catchphrase of this show, everybody? This is a test for all of you on your computers or phones. Books, they're like documentaries for smart people. So before I jump on have you seen the Jim Henson biography? It's pretty good. No, Because I'm reading a Jim Henson biography first. So I can immediately say to anybody who goes, did you see the Jim Henson documentary? I'll go, yeah, the book was better. And feel righteous and better than everybody. So I will be reading this book that I've had for like a decade. I remember I used to talk to my uncle all the time and say, by the way, in case you're saying, my doctor did say be on the lookout if your antidepressants make you manic. So I've had this book for like 9 years when it came out in paperback, but I remember saying to my uncle all the time, like, why isn't there a biography on Jim Henson? This is like a singular, he was like the Tyler Perry of making good shit for kids. Like, he was a mammoth enterprise, one of a kind unto himself. And so I bought this book, and because I was such a big Jim Henson fan, I didn't read it for the 9 years that I've owned it. But when that documentary came out, I said, this is an opportunity for me to be better than other people. So this will also be read this month. So I may review all 3. I may review 2 of the 3, but the books keep getting read, and you're going to have to keep watching these. So thank you, everybody, for joining me this month. Thank you for being Patreon subscribers. Spread the word, although nobody cares. And remember, I already said it, so I shouldn't have to say it again, but books, they're like documentaries for smart people.